Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 320, Seders in the Streets. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And it's early April, so you know what that means. Passover is coming up. So today we are really excited to have a conversation about a new take on Passover. Before we do, we want to share another little surprise with you. As you remember, we have launched our Yeshiva Center for Jewish Learning and Unlearning, and we have been doing these full semester 12-week classes. They're going strong now. We're so excited to have over 70 students engaged in these full semester classes. And we thought that it would be fun and meaningful and important and valuable to have a number of short classes, only 3 weeks, that will take place in the period between Passover and Shavuot. That's called the Omer, and it's a period that leads up to the holiday of Shavuot, which is traditionally the idea that that is when we got the Torah at Mount Sinai. So we thought it'd be really cool to have these unbound learning experiences leading up to that holiday. So we are thrilled to announce 6 3-week classes. We're going to have 2 sessions of 3 weeks, the first 3 weeks after Passover, and then the second 3 weeks after Passover, or you could look at it as the 3 weeks before Shavuot. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But we have 6 classes that are going to be taught by some of the most exciting guests that we've ever had on Judaism Unbound. We'll talk about some of the classes that are going to take place in the second session in a few weeks, but let me just say a brief word about the classes that are going to be taking place in the first session, which starts the week of April 25th. We're going to have a class called Ebb and Flow, the Psychedelic History and Future of Judaism, taught by Zach Kamenetz, who is our guest on episode 225. And then we are going to have a class called Encountering the World, the How and Why of Jewish Practice, taught by Becky Silverstein, who was our guest on episode 273 and is the co-founder of the Trans Halacha Project. And then the other class is called Queer and Present Prophecy, a playful and provocative exploration of Isaiah, taught by Jericho Vincent, who was our guest on episode 274. If you want to learn about these classes and our other short classes, just head to unyeshiva.com, that's UNYESHIVA.com, or just go to judaismunbound.com/classes. We are so excited to be offering these 3-week classes this spring. And now let's turn our attention to our guests for this episode, 2 leaders of the Exodus Alliance, Nate DeGroot and Madeline Canfield. The Exodus Alliance is a group of multi-faith organizations, faith leaders, and everyday people taking action for climate justice. It's spearheaded by the Shalom Center, founded by Arthur Waskow, who was our guest on episode 166, where we talked about Passover there too, because Arthur Waskow is also the founder of the Freedom Seder. And this is essentially the next stage of Arthur Waskow's consideration of what Passover should be all about in our time, really tying it to climate change. And we're also really excited to let you know that this coming week, we're going to be releasing a bonus episode in which Arthur Waskow is going to give some historical context and words of wisdom regarding the urgency of our fight to combat climate catastrophe. Our first guest today, Nate DeGroot, currently serves as national organizer for the Shalom Center. He previously served as associate director at Hazon in Detroit and as the inaugural Jewish Emergent Network Rabbinic Fellow at Ikar in Los Angeles. Nate DeGroot has rabbinic ordination from Hebrew College. Our second guest, Madeline Canfield, is a sophomore at Brown University and is the organizing coordinator of the Jewish Youth Climate Movement, which we'll also refer to as JYCM, which is one of the organizations working with the Shalom Center to pioneer Exodus Alliance. Just a word on the Jewish Youth Climate Movement. It was founded in 2019 and is a Gen Z-led movement dedicated to combating climate change and to environmental justice from a Jewish lens. Its goal is to make taking collective action toward climate justice a central defining feature of what it means to be Jewish over the next decade. So I personally am very relieved to know that such an organization exists, and it's also exciting to know that the Exodus Alliance exists. So without further ado, let's jump into our conversation about what is planned for this Passover. Nate DeGroot, Madeline Canfield, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
So let's start. Who is the Carbon Pharaoh?
So we are building Exodus Alliance, a coalition of multi-faith partners to take on the fossil fuel industry. We know that the fossil fuel industry is incredibly expensive to maintain. The projects that the fossil fuel industry takes on of the fracking, the laying of oil pipelines, the digging of coal are expensive projects. And so they require significant funding. The financial institutions that fund those projects and that industry, we are calling the corporate carbon pharaohs. These are the institutions and the individuals who are keeping all of us who depend on a healthy and thriving earth to exist. They're keeping us in a kind of servitude to the whims of the corporations that are profiting off of the destruction of our planet. These are the corporate carbon pharaohs.
When you ask the question of what is the carbon pharaoh, you're inherently exposing a power dynamic. And often when in any sort of segment of the population, someone asks the question, all right, the climate crisis, what caused it? There are a lot of different ways that you might answer it. You can go rather conventional, say late 1990s, early 2000s, even early 2010s answer would be the burning of fossil fuels caused the climate crisis. Obviously, scientifically, factually, this is true. But when, say, Gen Z, or a lot of people in movement spaces, a lot of people in increasing consciousness of the structures of the climate crisis see that question, they might point to something like corporate capitalism or colonialism or industrialization and white supremacy or patriarchy. And you see these massive systems. And so when you ask the question, what's a climate pharaoh, it's a really important one because it shows that this is a power dynamic and this is a hierarchy. And so by targeting the malactors in this massive crisis through ritual action, through communal action, you are looking at the fossil fuel industry, both their leaders, but also this massive financial structures that power it. And you're seeing how they intersect with all of these major systems of oppression. So you see climate pharaoh, fossil fuel pharaoh, oppression, slavery. Your mind goes to these things. So what does it mean? It means to be implicated in this massive history where these systems are all interlocking and are responsible. So it's fundamentally removing the burden from individuals, from community members, and showing how we are all positioned under those who have power, as Rabbi DeGroot was saying.
Well, we usually don't really talk about when we're recording this, and we're actually recording this a few weeks before it comes out, and we're at the height of the war in Ukraine. I don't know what it will be when it comes out. It may still be. It probably will still be. But just in case, I'm noting that here. And I'm thinking about this idea of the carbon pharaoh in relation to the war in Ukraine, because it feels like we have seen all kinds of elements that I think strengthen the way that you're talking about as a pharaoh. For example, it took a long time until there was any movement at all to ban the import of Russian oil in the US and also in Europe, because there's some sense that the oil is so deeply ingrained into society, and or the reaction of people to the rise of gas prices would be so different and, bad for local politicians than any other kind of consequence that there might be, that there was this great hesitancy to do anything about Russian oil, even though obviously the money that is being paid for Russian oil is fueling the ability of Russia to go to war in Ukraine. And it just feels like that. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about just how the way that Western society is constructed such that it becomes increasingly difficult to dislodge even a small percentage of that, when obviously, and everybody agrees that the moral case to do so is more than strong.
I think it's a great question. I think one of the things that we can ask is, if the world weren't dependent on fossil fuels, what would geopolitical power look like? How would it shift? How would our dependence on Russia, Russian oligarchs, oil-producing companies actually change if power was democratized and made renewable? There was a targeted campaign on the day that Russia invaded Ukraine from US lobbyists trying to convince the American public that now is the time to ramp up production of fossil fuels, to increase production of fossil fuels, because there was a sense that we would no longer be able to rely on Russian sources for oil and gas and coal. Of course, what we're suggesting is exactly the opposite. The problem is the same. We agree with the problem that being dependent on someone else for energy that not only kills the earth and kills all of creation, but that also allows individual players or countries to wield so much power. We agree that that's the problem, but the solution that we're suggesting and really demanding as part of Exodus Alliance and this larger coalition is scaling down and ending all production of and dependence on fossil fuels and ramping up and supporting renewable energy infrastructure. And if we were to transition to renewable energies, the corporate carbon pharaohs of this world, who are actual players and based in actual countries and part of geopolitical dynamics, would no longer have that kind of power over us, and we would be doing significantly better for the planet.
Fossil fuels in particular have historically militarized geopolitics and made it all about war and conflict. Whereas we see the climate crisis as the great exacerbator. So it's going to cause much more war. It's going to cause ruptures between different communities, nations, et cetera. And so if you see Exodus Alliance as a really strong paradigm of what a fossil-free future, a future in which we have actuated the just transition and have created a green, ecological justice, climate justice future, you see so many different faith communities and just communities and just identity-based communities coming together in this broader sacred season. So that is the term that we're using to describe how there's a confluence of religious holidays in a lot of different traditions and communities, all happening around the same time, all happening around Earth Day. So to imagine what it would be to resist the tyranny of certain fossil fuel infrastructure projects is to imagine something like Exodus Alliance, is to imagine a reality in which the solutions to the climate crisis are based in peace, are based in not communities not being in conflict with each other. Because what we will see if we don't do this is not only more in situations like what we're seeing with Russian oligarchs and certain countries and corporations and various actors being in conflict, you'll see a rise of things like totalitarianism, in which a country like Russia can go and invade another democracy because of the instability that happens when a massive natural disaster happens, when we run out of fuels, we're not using green energy. Whereas in sharing something that is inherently about the future, renewable energies that are based in the replenishing resources of the earth, you have a different notion of time and borders. And you see that these things aren't really bordered. And so you can have a sort of peace that our current geopolitics doesn't allow for.
It strikes me that in the biblical narrative of the Exodus, the Pharaoh that was ruling over the ancient Israelites was perpetuating a world and a society and an existence of scarcity, right? A scarcity of time to be able to produce the bricks that needed to be made to build the pyramids. And I think what we're talking about here is a different kind of scarcity of exhaustible resources, which as they are exhausted and depending on who has control over them, that can lead to militarized conflict, that can lead to wars to determine who has access to gas or oil, who has access to water, who has access to breathable air, who has access to soil that can be planted. And so I think what renewable energies offer is a shift into an abundance mindset, to say that actually we all have access to energy sources. We all have the ability to be free from the corporate carbon pharaohs.
I really appreciate the directions that you've taken this conversation already and sort of the stakes that you've lined out, the high stakes. I do want to zoom out a little bit and talk a little bit more about like the origin story of the Exodus Alliance in particular. And the angle I'd come at it from is there's people out there of many different religious, ethnic backgrounds, et cetera, who are trying to do work on climate change and to ultimately save our planet or save humans that are inhabiting the planet. And we don't always ask, like, why anchor it in Judaism? Like, why? Like, what's the actual benefit? And I'm not saying that because I don't think there's an answer, right? Like, I do actually, but I'm curious to hear the two of you articulate, like, why go about climate justice work, environmental justice work through Judaism? What can we bring specifically from our Jewish positionality? And because of the interfaith pieces that you're talking about, what maybe can religious holidays and belief systems and groups bring to this issue more generally? And also, because this is a Passover anchored set of actions, why Passover? I don't want to sound like rabbis like manufacture made up connections all the time, but like you could draw a connection to fighting climate change for any of a number of holidays, but y'all chose Passover.
Fundamentally, there are two ways of seeing the question of why come at it through your own tradition. And from the Jewish tradition, there are two answers that I think. One comes from the way that the tradition is set up, which is that it is inherently land-based, in which the holidays and the rituals and the teachings are based in understanding of how land and species that come from the land, whether those are vegetables or and fruits and grains and animals that we coexist with, how those are in operation with human societies, both for different cycles of the year and holidays and multi-annual procedures, like as this podcast is focusing on at the moment, the Shemitah year, the year of release, or the Jubilee year every 50 years. The way that this tradition worked is so based in the way that we root out harmful practices of the land and try to overwork it and try to extract it without understanding the longevity of the earth and the need for it to preserve. And there's also a broader, it's a sociological and historical understanding of the way existentialism works. So for this community, this is a people that has understood what it means to have an existential history, to see traumatic things, to see things that have fire and water and violence and the potential for the end, and to survive that and to take inspiration and hope from the end of something. I was reading a really interesting article by Yotam Marom, one of the big leaders in the Occupy Wall Street and just general movement space these days, that was talking, kind of drawing from various destructions in history and then also the Holocaust, and looking at how people responded politically through resistance to preserve themselves through traumas and life-altering situations in which it seemed that the end of the world was imminent, in which the end of their world was upon them, and yet they still saw a future beyond that end. So when I look at the climate crisis, so much of that for me is what each community brings to the stake of what do I have to lose, and what am I fighting for, and what am I trying to preserve, and what history, what familial, communal basis do I have to want to preserve what is currently, what future do I envision, and how do I use that history to teach me what it means to fight for something amidst the uncertainty of the future. So for JYCM, that's kind of story that we tell of those two parts of this is the tradition that brings us here, that is earth-based, we want to preserve, but this is also the communal, the history that shows us the importance of not giving up in the face of something so insurmountable and unthinkable that it is paralyzing, and that instead we have so many examples to draw from for inspiration. And so by organizing our own community, we know that every community must show up for this fight. Every single person needs to be doing climate justice action. In organizing movement theory, we know that it's powerful to bring your own people and to say, what power do I have? Who am I in networks with? So if we can do that, if we can mobilize our own institutions and get our young people to be the leaders, we're getting more people in the streets for that broader movement. And they're telling a specific story, one that is powerful for the people that they show up with, but also powerful for the broader world to understand, all right, here are the resources we have to fight this. And by resources, we mean traditions and hope.
Yeah, early on in our Torah, We see that humanity is referred to as Adam, and the earth itself is referred to as Adamah. They share a linguistic root. And we know that what we do to one another, we do to the earth. What we do to the earth, we do to one another. That these two pieces, humanity and the rest of creation, are so inextricably linked and come from a common source. This fight for climate justice is really a fight for God's survival, for all of creation's survival. I also think that it's strategic. We know that there are technologies that exist. There's expertise that's already out there to address the climate crisis in significant ways. We're not lacking in technology or expertise. What we're lacking in is willpower and spiritual motivation. I had heard a speaker once talk about how capitalism is the world's largest religion. If a religion is something that informs how we go about our day, how we orient our time, how we make decisions in our lives, so many of us are obligated to the lives that we live because of the economic system that we are in. And so I think part of what we're called to do is actually offer a compelling alternative to capitalism as a religion. And Judaism as a religion is compelling, and multi-faith traditions that all root in the earth and all root in the oneness of creation and one another are compelling alternatives. It is upon us to convert the carbon pharaohs of the world, and I don't think they'll do that on their own. How do we put public pressure? How do we draw inspiration? How do we mobilize thousands and tens and hundreds of thousands of people to actually say that we don't want to be beholden to a religion of capitalism and extreme wealth and greed and power? We want to be beholden to a religion that centers the sacred and uplifts the holy. Until we're able to draw that willpower and that soul power forth, we're going to continue to cycle through all sorts of oppressive systems and manifestations of the ills of our society.
Yeah, I'm finding just so many gems in what each of you are bringing. I've never heard, Madeline, what you were saying before. I've never heard a framework that you put so beautifully about how, like, in a sense, the Jewish experience with notions of existential threat is almost a kind, I want to call it like a superpower. Like, it gives us a set of lenses on global kinds of questions, existential kinds of questions. That's a really fascinating take. And for me, it's honestly a challenging thing because I spend a lot of my time thinking about the drawbacks of a community that builds itself on notions of existential threat, right? There's many problems that arise there too, but I'm finding myself very galvanized by your vision. I do want to get a little bit talkless, a little bit practical about like what's happening with Exodus Alliance. Like we started the way we want to start episodes, with the why, with like what the reasoning is behind an initiative. But now let's get to the what. Like, Exodus Alliance is a recently convened collaboration of a few organizations, and a bunch of stuff is going to be happening soon. What is the stuff? What are the organizations? Who are the people? What can people listening be excited to participate in a few weeks?
53 years ago, this Passover, on the 1-year anniversary of the murder of Dr. King, a young Arthur Waskow felt called to write the first Freedom Seder, thought to be the first time ever that a Passover Seder was oriented towards a contemporary liberation movement, the civil rights movement, and that it included voices from contemporary liberation movements. And so since then, Freedom Seders have happened all across the country and the world. Now, Rabbi Arthur Waskow has gone on to live a life of activism and Jewishly rooted teaching and inspiration. And so a number of months ago, he was looking at the upcoming holiday calendar and noticed that in addition to Passover and Easter falling at the same time, that this year also Ramadan is during a similar season. It actually spans both of those holidays. And in addition to that, there are holy days on the Sikh, Buddhist, and Hindu calendars, plus the equinox, World Water Day, Earth Day, and importantly for the Shalom Center, the anniversary of Dr. King's murder and that first Freedom Seder. This is from March 17th through May 6th, a sacred season for climate justice, and the international multi-faith climate organization Green Faith is holding that larger umbrella, trying to mobilize faith communities all around the world to lean into their particular holy days to engage in climate justice and learning and education and in action. Exodus Alliance came about as a response to all of this with a vision of leaning into Passover as a holiday and the Exodus story as a shared narrative amongst many traditions and many peoples, and also in the broadest sense, freedom from oppression and from narrow places and tight places into expansiveness and abundance. And we've built out a coalition of over 36 organizations, from Jewish justice organizations, Jewish climate organizations, multi-faith justice and climate organizations, and with core partners of Jewish Youth Climate Movement and Dayenu, we are working hand in hand to try to support Passover street seders, political action, ritual-based holy action in front of the corporate carbon pharaoh bank branches and asset manager headquarters all across the country. We're looking at a couple dozen, at least, Passover street seders happening throughout America, throughout the week of Passover and in the week before and after.
So JYCM has been engaging in protest increasingly in the last 6 months to a year. We're a movement that started during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we began in Zoom space, but we came together as a bunch of middle, high school, and college students. I'm a college student who came of age in the rise of Gen Z youth activism across a lot of different issues. And so we grew up in the streets. We grew up, for those of us who have a really strong political consciousness, coming to gain that consciousness and do action. And then we all came together during COVID, and we were siloed into these little Zoom screen boxes and missed that community that comes from direct action, from nonviolent direct action. In this movement in particular, bridging ritual with action. So you can have something that is very old and wise, which is the tradition, the ritual, the Seder itself, these teachings and these small little motions in which you may dip a finger into a wine glass at the mention of a plague. And so diminishing very symbolically our own joy because of what has happened, the catastrophe that the ritual is commemorating. And then you have something which is really public and moral, protest or nonviolent direct action, in which you go to the site of a actor in society that is doing some sort of social ill. You go and you expose their action based on what you're doing. So far, we've done a few actions of this nature, a major one of which was an action outside of BlackRock, at BlackRock's headquarters in New York City, calling on their CEO to divest from fossil fuels. And it was a community action, but it wasn't necessarily as ritual-based as this. So really, we're excited that this is an opportunity for our movement to come and say, here are the two things that make us who we are. We're young activists. We take to the streets. We call out institutional structures of power, and we're young people who are steeped in this tradition that we are gaining wisdom from, ancestral wisdom, and trying to preserve. So the ability to come together at Exodus Alliance is the ability to do both at once. So ritual protest in any sort of movement, particularly the one that we are building, is powerful because people think ritual just kind of sociologically has moral authority, but it also shows this is why we are here. This is the very thing that empowers us and teaches us how to show up in the streets. And it's the very thing that we are fighting to preserve.
Madeline, I'd like to pursue this question with you about what will happen at a street Seder. And I'm thinking particularly about it because I worked on campus for over a decade with college students. And more over time, as I was working on campus, I would ask college students, basically, we'd have focus groups, we'd have groups. It's just not one-on-one. And I would say, has anybody here had a really powerful Passover Seder experience that transformed you? And almost to a person, the answer was no. Even the Orthodox students, what people liked about Passover was what I call the Thanksgiving dimension of Passover. The family gets together, and there were elements that they liked about parts of it, the singing and whatever. But the idea that the Seder, in my view, what the Seder is supposed to do, which is have a transformational impact on people. So when you finish the Seder, you're a different person than when you walked in. That didn't seem to be happening. And I'm wondering here whether the idea of a street Seder focused on climate justice could have the potential actually not only of using the ritual of the Seder in a creative way, but also maybe reimagining the ritual of the Seder so that it would actually work better even at a regular Seder. So I'm curious what you have in mind in terms of what's actually going to be happening there. And also, like, how do you think about what I just described? You know, does that accord with college students today?
I have a really strong generational identity. I think Gen Z grew up seeing a lot of things and came to see itself as a cohesive, yet not in any sort of way monolithic generation that understands its own generational identity. So in terms of what does Gen Z think, I am not sure how everyone has seen it, but I would probably posit that more people of my generation have seen the Seder as not one individual instance that was particularly transformational, but ability to recognize certain elements and to say, this helped me gain a consciousness of where freedom does not exist in the world, or where power dominates in ways that we need to shift it, and what it can mean to stand up for justice and transform some sort of political situation based on communal reaction and power. I would say that it gave me that sense of understanding. I have a lot of memories of my mom growing up reading passages she would write at a certain part in the evening, and she would stand up and she would read. And this year I am thinking about X issue. One particular instance, nothing comes to mind personally. I think it's the accumulation, and that's the power of ritual. Ritual action on a smaller scale is that you have it over and over and over and over again. It's replicable. People can all do it. So that's the power of Exodus Alliance. We're going to have it across many cities. And it's like a regular ritual. It comes around every year, and the accumulation across time increases its meaning. So I think absolutely the act of doing a Seder is a protest against any sort of historic recursion of the founding story of slavery and the exodus from Egypt. So to see it as a protest is to see the ritual as a way of fighting back. And so to put it in the street, I think can have tremendous impacts on how people can relate to a ritual and say, oh, this thing that maybe feels old or I don't really relate to it in this day. I think people will look at it and say, oh, this has deep resonance and direction for tackling a major existential threat in my own life. In terms of what we're going to be doing at these actions themselves, well, it will vary from city to city. Generally, we're going to see a certain level of the Seder ritual on display in an honorable yet performative way that is dramatic and exposing some sort of injustice. So say in New York City, most likely we will be having a table laid out in front of the financial institution that we're targeting, in which various faith leaders will be sitting there acting out portions of the ritual, particularly telling the Exodus story with potential sub-ins for our modern context, and doing the reading of the 10 plagues in relation to the 4 cups of wine, in which they will have symbolism because the ritual itself is symbolic. Another really cool thing that will come from that is potentially having cups of quote unquote wine that are really water dyed black to represent oil. And so to dip fingers into those oils at the mention of each plague and to show the oil impact, the stain onto the actual earth. So we'll be morphing rituals themselves and showing that their symbolic meaning has tangible meaning for the actual institution that we are targeting and for the people who are sitting there today.
The Passover Seder, the Passover Haggadah, the telling of the Passover story, tells us that in each generation, each person is obligated to see themselves as if they personally went forth from the narrow place of Mitzrayim or ancient Egypt. And so if a Passover Seder is only reflecting on something that happened in the past, I think we're missing one of the key purposes of Jewish ritual generally and the Passover Seder in particular. The redemption that happened as the Israelites and the mixed multitude left Mitzrayim, left the narrow place and made it to the wilderness, that redemption was only a kitzat geula, a small redemption, and that actually our fuller redemption as a Jewish people, as all of humanity and as all of creation is still required of us. That's still in the future and something that we need to strive towards. And so these rituals, these Passover street seders are an opportunity to continue to live out the Passover story and to continue to strive towards that fuller redemption that we all are seeking. In some of the conversations that we've had, folks have talked about choreography of the splitting of the Red Sea, this moment when the Israelites and the mixed multitude finally escape from Pharaoh and his hardened heart and his army and cross the sea to the other side, to the promised land. And so what would it look like for the throngs of people to actually part and to have the Moses and the Aaron and the Miriam cross the Red Sea and even go into these various bank branches or asset manager headquarters and hand a letter to the CEO or to be passed to the CEO with the demands and asks that we are making to divest fully from fossil fuels and invest in renewable energy. We've also talked about the importance of elders and youth connecting. I'm here representing the Shalom Center, and 88-year-old Arthur Waskow and Madeline is here representing Gen Z and the Jewish youth climate movement. And so this sense of Lador Vador, from the elder generation to the youth generation, both collaborating, the elders supporting the youth and vice versa. What does it look like for the elders and the youth to turn towards one another and actually be in this together? And so as part of that, Rabbi Waskow and the Shalom Center produced an Earth and Justice Freedom Seder Haggadah. And this will be an opportunity for folks, both in public action and demonstration, to incorporate rituals in there, as well as people sitting around a table at home or with family or friends, to include elements of this Seder as part of their own Seder rituals as well.
So I have a question that has the potential to sound like a critique, but it really isn't. So I want to say that as I begin asking it. I have a question that is not just about the Exodus Alliance, and it's not just about even your Seders, but it's about something much broader, and I'm curious to hear both of your approaches to it. I went and I Googled the date of the original Freedom Seder in 1969. It was on April 4th, 1969. Passover began in 1969 on the evening of April 2nd, and the two sort of Chag days, the two ritually observed holidays where certain people don't do certain activities, that ends the evening of April 4th. The Freedom Seder was just after that. So it was just after those official holiday parts end. And it's still a holiday, but it's sort of a different status. And I also noticed that with these actions, your days that you've highlighted are April 19th to 21st, which are not the first 2 days of Passover when traditionally a lot of people have Seders. They're later. And once again, I love everything you're doing. I want people to go to these actions on whatever day they're happening. But I do want to ask a big question, which is, it seems to me like there's something that holds us, and I'm including myself in this. It's not an external directed question. There's something that holds us back from doing certain kinds of Jewish rituals that are newer, a Freedom Seder, a Seder in the streets, on the Passover Seder nights themselves. We feel like if we did it then we might not be doing our more classic, even if it's not traditional, like sort of the Thanksgiving one that Dan talked about, where you're at home, you're around a table, you have haggadahs. We feel like we need to put these on, the third day or the fifth day, like one of the other days of Passover. And I really want us to ask what that messaging sort of says when across, not just your organization, like when in the Jewish ecosystem, all of the sort of creative Seders are on the later days, and the more classical ones are on the first 2 days. And this happens with other holidays too, right? Like there's often, for holidays where electronics are forbidden, like there's often sort of traditional observances on the day itself, and maybe a day before or a day after. There's digital ones where people are doing stuff with technology. Like, what if we were to sort of permit ourselves to say, this Seder in the streets is in fact my Passover Seder? How might that really hammer home the messaging points that you're making? Might we be able to push ourselves on that front? Or, by the way, would you push back on me and say there actually is a place for distinguishing? Like, how do you approach that timing question as it relates to, the historical Freedom Seder and these current Seders in the streets?
I think it's a great question. And the way that I tend to think about it is, first of all, I think there's an accessibility question. when it comes to a Jewish holiday where there are a range of traditional observances that would dictate who or who couldn't attend a Passover street seder that required driving or public transportation or megaphones or things of that nature. Although perhaps there are traditional seders on the first and sometimes the second night, the holiday lasts that entire time, right? It's a longer holiday. In the kind of story of the Israelites and the mixed multitude leaving Egypt, right, that leaving actually lasted a number of days. On the seventh day of Passover, it's traditionally observed as the time when the Israelites actually crossed the Red Sea itself. So what does it look like to add in ritual that is central to the holiday, is not kind of incidental or tangential, but actually helps to redefine what observance of the Jewish holiday looks like? I would also add that I think there is a deep value in the home-based ritual that some people enjoy as well. I think the familial aspect and the questions on a deeply personal level of what am I still enslaved to? What changes do I need to make on this kind of micro level? I think hopefully all of those levels are being examined and leaned into during this time. I think it's a great question. And certainly I could imagine people choosing to host one of these seders during the first or second night. There's also strategy questions that come into it of when is the bank branch or asset manager headquarters building open? When would there actually be people there that we could go into the lobby or something like that? As a multi-faith coalition, there's also considerations around if it's later at night, will our Muslim partners be able to make it back to their break fast at the end of their celebration of that day of Ramadan? So there's a lot of considerations that go into it. I think what feels important to me is that these don't seem or become incidental to the holiday, but actually are seen as a direct expression of that holy time.
I love this question because I think it's really hard. On one level, there is a practical strategy question, which Rabbi DeGroot was mentioning, in that we want people to show up in the streets. We want to be accessible. Accessibility is central. Then there's something broader, which is what does it mean to have a communal identity and a ritual-based identity that is justice-based and in many ways politicized. I think it's fundamental for people to see their Jewish identity in relation to politics and to see justice work as not remotely marginal or additional, but the main thing. I see in the background of
Madeline's referencing my Zoom background as we recorded this, which is a picture that I use in my This Too is Torah class of the Onion Yeshiva.
Lex, says this too is Torah, and we see a lot of activism going around, and the Torah is activism. But I think this comes down to a question that happens a lot more regularly when Jewish organizers that I know often don't protest or try not to protest on Shabbat. From the conversations I've had with them, it is a wonderful reason, which is the understanding that as organizers, this goes way beyond the Jewish community, we are inundated with the work. We are ensconced in this white supremacy culture that we are fighting with the work, but then also makes us think that we don't have the time or the capacity to rest. And so when you don't do the actual protest on Shabbat or the first two or last 2 days of Pesach, of Passover, or of many different holidays in which those days are the days that are like the Shabbat of that holiday, the days where you don't work and you rest, you're bringing the work into that sacred space. And what could it mean to talk about those issues, but also to give ourselves the space to rest in a restorative way that fights burnout, that allows us to think, to take a step back and say, what are we doing in this movement, in this work, and then go out into the streets in the days after. To constantly be fighting through our own rituals sometimes prevents us from the ability to take a step back and envision a world free from all these injustices, in which all that stands is the thing that we were fighting for in the first place. Despite that, we also want to create a world in which the Jewish practices of fighting for justice are the main ones, and yet there can be that space.
Lex, if I could be so bold as to answer your question a little bit for myself, because I've been known to say on this podcast that I would find it much more meaningful to go to a protest on Shabbat than to actually go to synagogue on Shabbat. So I kind of feel the same way in this case about a Passover Seder. Like, I personally would really love to have my Seder not at home, but in front of some, evil empire company that I'm protesting against. So I'm hoping that in future years, maybe we'll have both paths available. But actually, what I was thinking about was really building on what you were saying, Madeline, because let's say that my desire to actually go protest instead of having a Seder isn't the majority view. It would be really interesting to think about just exactly what you said. And I'm wondering, if you already have stuff that facilitates this for folks like our listeners. And I've been thinking about the holidays this way for a while. I think that a lot of us experience the holidays a little bit too much like Shabbat, in the sense that we experience it as a day off, a different day, and something happens on that day, and then the next day comes and we go back to our lives, as opposed to seeing that holiday as the first day of the rest of our lives. So it makes me wonder, what could a Passover Seder look like reimagined, so that it leads to the next day we go to this protest and the next day we do more and more and more, as opposed to some kind of cyclical thing where every year we come back to this holiday again and we say, oh yeah, we don't think anybody should be a slave, and then the rest of the year we're buying oil and we're buying clothes from places that are made by child labor and all kinds of things. It doesn't seem to be working, I guess, is my point. And the question is whether inherent in what you're working on is not only this one kind of action, but maybe a reimagination of the way that the whole process could lead to a lifetime of action.
Throughout Jewish tradition, there are moments where we have preparation for the holiday itself, right? Like the meeting to plan the meeting, Ta'anit Esther, the fast of Esther, leading into Purim, that there's actually spiritual work that we're being invited to do to get ready to celebrate Purim. And I wonder if we could think about it kind of along those lines, that the home-based Seders, if people are choosing to have those, what is the spiritual work and preparation that those allow for, to be able to then have the courage to take to the street in mass numbers the following day or sometime later that week? How do we envision and live into and get to experience a taste of the world that we're trying to create, so that when we go onto the streets, we're able to engage in that act of sacred protest from a place of real wholeness and possibility and a sense of redemption, maybe as opposed to, or as a kind of overriding experience, more so than maybe anger or rage or hatred or something like that. What's the power of the Jewish spiritual practice that leads into the political action? And this is something that we're thinking about a lot at the Shalom Center right now. Rabbi Waskow wrote Seasons of Our Joy, his best-selling book, many years ago, because his sense was that out of all of the things that American Jews do or don't do, have in common or don't have in common, that the Jewish holidays are the things that American Jews have in common the most. We, as a American Jewish community, have plenty of home-based ritual, the Passover Seder around our table, or the lighting of the Chanukiah, the candelabra at Hanukkah time in our homes. We have plenty of congregational-based or community-based celebrations, maybe a second night congregational Passover Seder, or the lighting of a menorah in the city center of wherever you live. We don't have a lot of national observance of Jewish holidays. Certainly the stuff that you all have been doing at Jewish Live during the pandemic and making Shavuot, the Jewish holiday, virtual and accessible to everyone. That's an incredible example of that. Around the ban on Muslims entering the US, a lot of organizations were taking the holiday of Tisha B'Av, which is a holiday of deep grief and mourning, and kind of contextualizing it within the context of immigration. What would it look like for the national Jewish community to actually engage in holidays and in the Jewish year cycle through political action, through street protest, through embodying the justice principles and the vision of a more whole and more just future in this kind of public, demonstrative, and holy way? That's one of the things that we're thinking about, expressed through Exodus Alliance and potentially through other holidays and in the cycles of holidays in years to come.
I wanted to make a connection between what we're talking about, and I know what the Jewish Youth Climate Movement is also thinking about Shemitah, as we have been. And I'm thinking about it in two ways. One, I'm thinking, to what I said about the idea of Shabbat and what you said, being kind of a rest, but then shouldn't just be a rest. It should be a time for, like Nate's saying, a time to build up strength to actually go in and do. So I'm just curious more broadly how y'all are thinking about Shemitah. For the first time, I realized something about how we have been thinking about Shemitah, which is that we have been expressing a lot of annoyance at the rabbis of the Talmud for not having had the insight to understand that Shemitah could still be relevant outside the land of Israel. And we thought that was a big mistake on their part. However, I would say that I understand it a little bit in the sense that when you have your own country and you're in control of the state, then you can say, hey, we really have a lot of power here, and the power that we have also brings with it the capacity to do a lot of damage, and therefore we should take responsibility for how we wield that power. And I can imagine a group that is lost their state and they're going into exile, maybe rightly, maybe wrongly, saying, look, we don't have power anymore. Okay, I get that they're not going to really be focused on their power and its capacity to damage. But it feels like now that we understand not only that we as individual people and we as Jews, and we see, and what we're still talking about with Ukraine, that we see that there really is a lot of power that we have to do a lot of damage, even as individual people. Maybe that's an angle to sort of reimagine taking Shemitah seriously as applying beyond the land of Israel, because actually we are finally recognizing the power that we have to destroy the earth more globally. And so now is the time to really resuscitate Shemitah. I mean, that's a half-formed thought, but it really came up for me as you were talking earlier, Madeline. So I was hoping that you might even have some things to say about Shemitah and what the youth today are doing about it.
Absolutely. In regard to Shemitah, I think that a great jumping off place for envisioning what it means is that idea of power. So let's take power and think about it in the way that social movements, in the way that organizers think about power in many ways. Is power is the capacity to use the tools that you have to achieve what you desire. We see power as this inherently negative thing, but I think power is rather neutral. Power is inevitable. Power is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. When we want to shift power as people concerned with justice work, we want to take our own resources and say, what power do we have? We have our institutions. We have our traditions. We have our visions. We have our numbers. And we are going to wrest power from the power holders in order to create a more democratic, equal, and just society, one free from the climate crisis. And so when thinking about Shemitah, we can see it as this rather old, some might say esoteric idea of living with the land that is tied to one nation and one extremely removed historical context. And you could also see it as a framework that, like any Jewish text, is always being readapted, is always morphing, and always has lessons for modernity, depending on how you interpret it. So interpretation is like power. Power organizing is to power what interpretation is to any sort of Jewish framework. In this case, Shemitah is the framework. And so we totally can see Shemitah as a blueprint for climate justice work, because it tells us what is wrong and it tells us what we need to do instead, which is to release debts. That's one example, and I can go through, enumerate many of them. But at JYCM, we've been focusing on that one a lot because we did an action at BlackRock, and now we're doing more climate finance stuff. So what does it mean to do something that is rather anti-corporate capitalism, to release debts, as Shemitah teaches us, to stop extracting from the land, to take what we have, and to repurpose it for a year? What does it mean to divest, to pull money out of where it has been loaned, and to say, all right, banks, financial institutions, they say, all right, fossil fuel companies, we have given to you, but no more. All right, university endowments, all right, massive organizations, we as a community have capitulated to your financial visions, but no more. And so you continue to put power back into those implicated by, but those less centered in major institutions, like the way Shemitah tells us to look at those who are not the owners of the land, to look at the slaves in many ways, to look at those in our community who are most vulnerable and marginalized, and to say, how does society look to those people? How can it look if we center them? Shemitah, because it's based in a place and a time that we are removed from, it's all about reinterpretation and taking the lessons and understanding what could that mean. What we have still is the texts. We still have land everywhere. So what does it mean if we both do a land-based practice, like give food away in a mutual aid way, but also if we say, hey, our tradition tells us, fossil fuel companies, what you're doing is antithetical to our beliefs, then it becomes a communal religious matter. Then you're saying, hi, we have power because we see society in a different way. It's extremely powerful for what JYCM likes to call lovingly agitating our own communities by empowering them to join with us. We ask the question, which side are you on? And in our actions, more and more, Jewish communities are saying, we're on your side, JYCM. We're on the side of our young people who have grown up in these institutions, but recognize that these institutions don't always reflect our eagerness and passion for direct action. And so there's a change happening. We can use Shemitah to say so many Jews in massive organizations or just in American Jewish institutional life have seen capitalism in the current iteration of capitalism as the only option. And what does it look like if we look at our massive corporations and say, what if we adapted our economic visions to not something that was just Western, but something that's Jewish? And there's so much power in saying a different world is possible based on what our own community is putting forth.
I've got a closing question that is not directly about Passover, and it's not directly about the actions you're doing. It is about what Nate alluded to a while back regarding the intergenerational nature of this work, where Arthur Waskow, a very young 89 as we record this episode, and a Gen Z organization that, by the way, Madeline, my sense is you're kind of an elder within JYCM as a college student. There's actually mostly high school students who are driving your work. The fact that those are 2/3 of the 3 convening organizations, I think, is incredibly powerful, to use that power word. And I think it's important for us to name and recognize that in a Jewish institutional environment or context where so much of what is hammered home is that, like, people between those ages are in charge, where so thoroughly we've concocted a Jewish institutional ecosystem where I actually think we're sort of echoing a problematic dynamic in the Torah. The Torah sort of has these brackets where a 20-year-old male, it becomes sort of age in society, and a 60-year-old male, sort of, once they age out of that, they're no longer in that same category. I think if you look around in Jewish life, we've mostly empowered people in that broad range. I think we could even largely say like 30 and up, and generally below, I don't know where you would draw at 65, 70. But I'm curious if you could just reflect, like, what messaging are you offering up to the Jewish community that's actually not just about combating climate change? That's the core objective, obviously. But what are you bringing to the table around how we might revision our Jewish society and our broader society in terms of which age cohorts sort of count, in quotes, which age cohorts are sort of fully formed humans, which age cohorts we trust to lead us, and which age cohorts, my own included, might benefit from taking a step back and learning from others?
I'll say briefly that what you've elaborated on is ultimately the vision of JYCM. We're a climate justice movement, yes, because we see climate justice as this defining issue through which we intend to reorient the entire Jewish community towards intergenerational direct action. To be Jewish to us is about reacting in a moral justice-oriented way, publicly and in privately, in our institutions and on the streets, when we represent ourselves as Jews out in the world, and when we are simply being Jews with no one but Jews. And so that is about a rotundity between all of those generations, because young people see these issues differently than those who came before us. And yet we are doing this, particularly as young Jews, because of the way Jewishness was taught to us by the elders in our communities and those who came before us. So climate justice work across all communities that I've experienced it as has been young people leading and doing activism and organizing, and in many ways being put into leadership positions while doing this because of the work that came before them, because of our movement ancestors, our communal ancestors, our ethnic, religious, national ancestors. In the Jewish community, we intend, as a Jewish movement, JYCM intends to do both things, to show up at this broader movement for climate justice, but to show the Jewish community what it can be if we look to young people, not even just as leaders, but as stewards of a power shift. Or isn't just those who are adults at a middle age, but those across a variety of generations who are looking to each other as mutual leaders, because we know we see the world differently. We grew up, especially for American Jews, with shifting understandings of politics and justice work and identity, and there's so much to learn from each other. So by being a movement that's a lot about training and education, as much as it is about action, we can reorient the way that we talk about these issues, the way that we educate on these issues, and then we ultimately show up in action on these issues.
So this idea that our tradition offers us preparation leading into holidays and sacred observances, another example of that is the Shabbat before Passover, known as Shabbat Hagadol, or the Great Shabbat. The Haftarah, the prophetic reading on that day, is from the prophet Malachi, and the words are incredibly relevant for this day and for this question. So I'm going to read you a little bit of Rabbi Waskow's translation of this Haftarah and circle back to a response. The day is coming that will flame like a furnace, says the infinite Yah, the interbreath of life, when all the arrogant evildoers, root and branch, will like straw be burnt to ashes. Yet for those of you who revere my name, yes, my name, Yah, the interbreath of life, a solar sun of justice will arise, with healing in its wings, its winds, its rays. Here, before the coming of the great and awesome day of Yah, the breath of life, I will send you the prophet Elijah to turn the hearts of elders to the youth and the hearts of youth to the elders, lest I come and smite the earth with utter destruction. This sense of turning the hearts of the youths and the elders towards one another as a kind of redemptive strategy and necessity for the evil and destruction that exists in the world is so compelling to me. And the fact that it is right there in our religion as the preparatory reading leading into Passover just feels really resonant. Our tradition is thousands of years old. And so even the span of 3 generations is minuscule relative to the full breadth of Jewish tradition and certainly human connection to land and life. And yet in our kind of human frameworks and our span of memory and relationship, this is kind of the widest span that we often have. Most of us are lucky enough to maybe grow up with a grandparent, a few of us maybe with great-grandparents that we know at a young age. But for many of us, that 3 generation span of child, parent, and grandparent is often the kind of primary connection we have with generationality. And so our elders are the ones who are able to kind of reach back into the past and connect us with as much of the ancient as there is in kind of current human consciousness. And our youth, the people who are newest on the planet, are able to express what life is like right now and what is unfolding and how it's emerging in current times better than anyone else. And so to bring these 2 groups together at the end of the spectrum with everyone else in between working together feels like something that our tradition recognizes as valuable and critical, and something that is really exciting to me about this coalition and this work moving forward.
Thank you so much, Nate. Thank you so much, Madeline, for joining us. It's been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be in this space with you.
And thank you so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. A couple quick reminders. First off, Dan mentioned at the top that we've got some amazing mini courses, short 3-week course options through the Yeshiva that we would strongly encourage all of you out there to sign up for. We've got an amazing slate of talented teachers, and those courses will be offered between Passover and Shavuot, but you can register now. You can learn more at unyeshiva.com. That's UNYESHIVA.com, or just by heading to the Judaism Unbound website and clicking on Yeshiva. So definitely do that. And also on the website front, go to ExodusAlliance.org. Learn more about this amazing project that Nate DeGroot and Madeline Canfield talked about today, and learn about how you can participate at an action near you, how you can be of support even if there's not an action right near you, through digital platforms of one kind or another. All of that you can learn at ExodusAlliance.org. So, with that, we are going to close out this episode, and we're going to do so in the way that we always do, by encouraging you to be in touch with us. And there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook or Twitter or Instagram pages. All of those are at Judaism Unbound. Second, you can go to our website, JudaismUnbound.com. And third, you can email us at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. The last request we like to make is that we deeply appreciate any amount of financial donation that you're able to send our way, and you can do that via JudaismUnbound.com/donate on either a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift. So thank you so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.